Hello friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in this session we are going to continue in our series on business ethics and CSR. And friends, in this session we are going to specifically talk on the series on ethical decision making process. For the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Namita Rajput. Dr. Namita Rajput is principal in Sri Aurobindo Evening College, University of Delhi. Dr. Rajput is a prolific professor as well as she is author of numerous books. Friends, let's take advantages from her experiences and let's try to understand today's topic in detail, that is ethical decision making process. Now I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Namita Rajput, once again. Hello ma'am, welcome to the lecture.
Good morning viewers. Today the topic is very important as far as the ethical decision making process is concerned. Now decision making process, what it is and what steps are involved in any kind of a decision making, whether it is an ethical decision making or a general decision making. The process starts from that when you have number of alternatives in front of you, which alternative is best as far as your the desired outcomes are concerned, and according to what you choose as far as the outcomes are concerned, you decide that this is the best thing we should opt for. So decision making is a process of selecting a course of action among the multiple alternatives. This is the first thing which you must understand as a student, that a number of alternatives are there, like for example A process is there, B is there, C is there, D is there, and there are n number of alternatives which are present. But which alternative will suit you will depend upon what kind of outcomes you have thought about, what comes of desired outcomes you are thinking about. So you have to match and map your the alternatives with your desired outcomes, and wherein the final decision would come that this is the best process of taking the decision making. Every decision making process produces a final choice. Now the final choice again is an equation between the alternatives which are available and the desired outcomes which you are thinking about. So when you have an equation between the two, then you jot down to a final choice that yes, this is the final decision making process which we are striving for. It begins when we need to do something but we do not know what. When you start with the journey of any kind of a decision making, you are lost in the terms of alternatives because you have so much of choice which is available, but which choice suits you, you are in a dilemma that yes, this is the best or that is the best. So when you are able to equate between the two, you jot down that this is the specific alternative which chooses my desired outcome, and finally you decide. For example, when you go on for a shopping, you have so much of choice, the consumer choice is so much, so you are lost that whether this will suit me or that will suit me, or whether I should buy this or that. So again, when you have ample choice in front of you, the decision making becomes a problem. Deciding what to eat is also a problem. Deciding whom to vote when you talk about the electoral process is also a problem when you talk about the elections. So overall scenario, and under this backdrop, we have understood that what is a decision making process. So the prerequisites of any kind of a decision making process is that when you have a choice in front of you and finally you match your desired outcomes with you, and when there is an equation between the two, you take a final decision. And definitely it begins because you do not know what things will suit you and what things will not suit you. So it is a very difficult process to move on. So if you have the equation in front of you, then the things would be better and the decision making would also be better. Now we start with the decision making process, that what are the steps involved as far as the decision making process is concerned. Due to the large number of considerations involved in many decisions, decision support systems, that is the computer based systems, have been developed to assist the decision makers in considering the implications of the various courses of action. Now see, you have so many considerations in front of you which is present, and definitely you have nowadays a computer based support system which will analyze the alternatives with you, and definitely it will assist you in any kind of a decision making process. So the things which were there in the yesteryears were different, because there you used to apply only the analytical mind, but nowadays we have a computer based assistance systems also, wherein each and every alternative is taken into consideration, and the computer will decide upon certain parameters which are there in your mind and which will help in taking a decision making process. So the computer aided decision making process is definitely more wise to take, more objective to take. The subjectivity content as far as the computer aided assistance of the decision making process is lesser, because your whims and fancies have no role to play as far as the decision making process is concerned. So the decision making process involves the following steps. The first is defining a problem. So this is the first step as far as the decision making process is concerned. The ethical aspect would be added when you talk about the ethical decision making process. But yes, in any ways and in any kind of a decision making process, the steps which we are discussing now are there for every kind of a decision making process. The first is defining a problem. The most significant step in any decision making process is describing why a decision is called for and identifying the more desired outcomes of the decision making process. So this is what we have already talked about, that when you start with the process of the decision making, the most significant step in any decision making process is to identify your desired outcomes, that what specific results you are looking for. What are the specific desired outcomes in your frame of mind, and these are the ends which you have to achieve. So unless and until you're clear about your desired outcomes, to define a problem, to analyze it would be a very, very difficult task. So when you define a problem, the first thing which you have to keep in your mind is you have to consider the desired outcomes in your mind, followed by one way of deciding if a problem exists is to define the problem in terms of what wanted or expected the actual situation. So one way of deciding, as I said, when you talk about the decision making issues, you have to define in terms of what one wanted or expected and the actual situation. There is a difference between the actual situation and what you want. So which makes a lot of difference and which changes your desired outcomes also, because sometimes the situation is out of control, sometimes the situation is entirely different, and the desired and what you want is definitely different. So you have to keep these considerations in mind. Number one, the desired outcomes, and secondly, what you want and what you expect and what the actual situation is all about. So we have talked about the three parameters when you are defining a problem. Now taking it further, a problem is defined as a difference between the expected or desired outcomes and the actual outcomes. Now when you start with a problem, what you think is entirely different from what the actual situation is all about. So there's a difference between the desired outcomes and the actual outcomes. So all these pictures have to be clearly drafted in your mind before you take any kind of a decision making process. So this is a very critical consideration because how one defines a problem determines how one defines the causes and searches for the problem. Now definitely you have so many other considerations in mind when you talk about the decision making process. This is definitely a very critical consideration which you have to keep in mind as to how one defines a problem, because everyone has its own journey of life, all ups and downs which you face in your life. So it is entirely on a different paradigm. I take a problem in a different way compared to what you see a problem is also in a very different way, because our perception is different because of our journeys of life, because of our difference in demographic characteristics. So definitely what I perceive may not be what you perceive. So which makes a lot of difference, and definitely on the basis of which the causes and of course the solutions would also be different, because according to me the things would be different, according to you the things will be different, because you are born in a very different setup and your way of life is different, how you perceive the things is also very different, your income parameters are also different, because overall if you take everything in one frame, the decision making would differ from one person to another person. Now coming on to step 2, The step 1 we have already talked about, that is, you have to define a problem, keeping into considerations the desired outcomes, the actual situation, the individual's perception, the causes and the solutions, the search for the solutions. So keeping into all those considerations, you are able to define the first step in the decision making process, that is defining a problem. Now coming on to step 2, that is, you have to identify the alternative solutions to a problem. The decision maker should not limit themselves to obvious alternatives or what has worked in the past, but be open to new and better alternatives. They should consider as many alternatives as they can. Realistically, the decision maker should consider more than 5 in most of the cases. They should not have only 2 opposing choices, either this or that. When you are thorough with that, this is the problem in front of you. You have talked about the desired outcomes, you have talked about and done the complete analysis of the present situation, your other parameters, your perception, your demographic levels, and your problems and solutions, the search for solutions. And after that, you are able to define the alternative solutions to a problem. Now, as a matter of fact, you should keep your mind open and you should have ample choice as far as the alternative solutions to a problem is concerned. Because if you shut your mind to only 2 results, either this or that, the things would be very, very difficult. So as a matter of choice, as a matter of having a right kind of a decision making, you should always try and search for the solutions and you should have at least 5 of the alternatives which are going to suit you as far as the solution of the problem is concerned. Because the more the merrier, the more solutions you have in mind, the more better perception, accuracy about the decision making you would go for will be better. Now coming on to step 3, you have to evaluate the identified alternatives. While evaluating the alternatives, the decision makers should look at likely positive and negative sides of each alternatives. It is unusual to find one alternative that would completely resolve the problem, and it is better all others. The decision making should develop a confidence score for each alternatives. He needs to determine not just what results each alternative could yield, but how probable it is that those results will be realized, and if the evaluation is based on the facts, it is likely that the expected outcomes will occur. Now, you have to, after defining the problem, after finding out the alternative solutions for the problems, now is the time to evaluate each and every alternative. That is, what is the plus and the minus if you go for this solution and accept this particular alternative for the solution. So you have to see the positive side of each alternative. You have to see the negative side of each alternative. You have to do a complete synthesis of the problem in the light of the positive and the negative of all the alternatives which are present. And of course, you have to somewhere develop your confidence scores. That, like, if I go for, say, option A of the alternative for a particular solution for a problem, I can say with 95% confidence level that yes, this is the best solution, followed by the other alternatives which are present in front of you, because you always have to have a backup plan. If plan A falls, you have plan B in line. So under this, because we are living in a very dynamic world, we are living in a never-changing world, wherein the risk factor is perhaps the highest. So you cannot put all your eggs in one basket. You have to steer the best one, but yes, you have to have the various alternatives which are in front of you, and wherein you have to select one out of the best which are available. Suppose you have taken into considerations the 5 alternatives, you have developed the confidence scores of each alternatives, and now you should be able to come out with confidence that yes, alternative A is best, followed by B and C and D and E, for example. So you need to determine not just the results each alternative could yield, but how probable it is that those results will be realized. If evaluation is based on the facts, it is likely that the expected outcomes will occur. When you decide upon the plus and the minus of each alternative, you have to collect and you have to have the empirical evidence to this effect that yes, this is the best thing which is there in front of me, and this is how we have to move on with the life. And with the confidence, you are able to have that, yes, this is the expected results, and you have the the supporting evidence of whatever are the solutions, whatever are the problems in front of you, and then you should move on because your evaluation is based on the real facts, not on the stories. So the step 1 which we have talked about is about defining a problem. Then you have to have the identification of the various alternative solutions which are in front of you. Then you have to evaluate the identified alternatives which are there in front of you. Now coming on to step 4, that is make a decision. After evaluating the alternatives against accepted criteria, the managers screen the non-feasible alternatives and select the most appropriate alternatives that will help in achieving the desired objective. Alternatives can be selected through the following approaches. First, past experience serves as the guide for the future. Now, for example, in the past you have taken into consideration one alternative. After taking into consideration the plus and the minus, you have a right first-hand experience about taking that as a solution, and that perhaps is the base for moving in the future also. So that means the past experience becomes the guru for the future problems also, because you have a first-hand experience as far as the taking of that solution is concerned. The managers follow their past actions, their successes, failures, analyze them in the context of future environment, and select the most suitable alternative fit in the present solution. Experimentation. In the experimentation also, each alternative is put to practice and the one which is most suitable is selected. Their method is too costly, as implementation of every alternative to decision-making situation involves heavy capital expenditure. So when you talk about the decision-making process, the first tool which we have discussed now is the experiment. Experiment has its own plus and minus into consideration. You follow a particular action, and your success, failures are a part of it. You select the best alternative which is there in the present solution. When you talk about the experimentation, when you do the experimentation of each and every alternative which is present, it is very difficult to analyze each and every solution, each and every alternative for a particular solution, because it is too costly and it involves a huge capital expenditure also. So, we have to talk about the plus and the minus of each tool which is in front of you, which helps in the decision making process. The third aspect is your research and analysis. It helps to search and analyze the impact of the future variables on the present solutions, apply various mathematical models, select the most suitable alternative. This method is more suitable and less costly in terms of time and money as compared to the methods of experimentation and experience. Nowadays, the research and the analysis play a very pivotal and significant role, because the research tools are very, very effective, authentic and empirical in nature, wherein the role of whims and fancies are next to nil, and it gives you the authentic observations about each and every alternative which are there to help in taking a decision making process. So, you have certain econometric models, you have certain mathematical models which helps in analysis of the most suitable alternative which is present, considering the problems which are there in front of you. So this method is more suitable and less costly in terms of time and money as compared to the methods of experimentation and experience. Now, we are able to discuss till now that when you have to take a decision making process, the first thing which we have talked about is experience. That is, the past experience gives you a base for moving the future. This is very good. Second, experimentation. Experimentation is a virtue. It's very, very good to analyze the various alternatives to action. But yes, when you talk about the cost aspect attached to it, it is a very, very extremely costly process, because it involves a huge capital expenditure. Now comes the third, that is the research and analysis. The research and analysis process is perhaps the best one because you have certain variables in mind, which are past variables, future variables. You have a broader spectrum as far as the selection of the variables is concerned, and then you apply the mathematical models, econometric models, and select the most suitable alternatives which are there and which can help in taking a decision making process. So this method is more suitable and less costly in terms of time and money as compared to the methods of experimentation and experience. So till now we are able to compare the alternatives which are available to take the best decision making process as far as the solution for the alternatives are concerned. The first was experience, the second was experimentation, and the third is the research and the analysis. So the most important and the suitable method which we can think about is the experimentation aspect and the experience, which involves a lot of time, money and energy. But if you compare it with the research and the analysis, perhaps that is the best method to give you the most authentic results, because it involves a lot of scientific calculations, mathematical models, econometric models, which gives you the most desired outcomes compared to the other methods which we have discussed. Now coming on to the step 5, that is you have to implement the alternative. The selected alternative should be implemented with at least resistance from organizational members. Implementation must be properly planned, and those who will be affected by the implementation should be allowed to participate in the implementation process to make it more effective and fruitful. Implementation of alternative should ensure the following things. So before we move on with the other factors, let me tell you what the implementation of the alternative is. You have defined the problem. After that, you have taken into consideration the various alternatives which are available to take a problem. You have already evaluated the various identified alternatives by experience, by taking into consideration the other factors, that is experimentation, the research and analysis. Now you are able to find out that yes, this is the best alternative which suits my desired outcomes. Now is the time to implement them. So when you have to implement them, you must take into consideration the entire spectrum of the people who are impacted and affected by that decision making process. They should be, kept in loop always that yes, if we accept this method, which is the best solution for the desired outcomes and the problems, this is the result and these are the people who will be affected. So in the implementation, larger participation of the organizational people must be there. It should be meticulously planned. And of course, those who will be affected by the implementation should be allowed to participate in the implementation process to make it more effective and fruitful. And implementation of alternatives should ensure the following methods. First, the selected alternative should be communicated to everyone in the organization. Changes in the existing structure because of the implementation should also be communicated to everyone in the organization. Authority responsibility for implementation should be specifically assigned, and the resources should be allocated to respective departments for carrying out the decisions. Now, coming on to the things which you have to take into consideration before the implementation of the process is concerned. The first thing which you have to keep in mind, that when you select that yes, this is the process of taking into consideration the decision making process, so it should be communicated to each and every one in the organization that yes, we are in the process of accepting and implementing this process, followed by the changes in the existing structure because of the implementation should be communicated to everyone. So if you are changing the present structure because of that alternative which you have accepted and selected in the decision making process, then you must communicate the changes in the structure of the organization to everyone, followed by authority and responsibility for implementing should be specifically assigned. That is, authority and responsibility for implementation should be specifically assigned. That this is the authority and this is the responsibility of implementation, it should be specifically assigned. The resources should be allocated to respective departments for carrying out the decisions. Whenever and whatever decision making you take, when you select the alternative, there is so much of things involved. First, the communication to everyone. The changes in the structure should be communicated to everyone. It should be meticulously planned, followed by, like if you are changing some authority and responsibility structure or the organizational structure of the organization, it must be properly endorsed, properly communicated to everyone. Then of course, the resources should be allocated to respective departments for carrying out the decisions. The decision making process. The budgets, schedules, procedures, controls should be established to ensure the effective implementation. A committed workforce should be promoted in this regard, and unless everyone is committed to the decision making, the desired outcome will not be achieved. So we are here to discuss in one go the decision making process, which is the most focal topic of today. We have to start with defining of a problem, that where the problem is. So you have to connect with the desired outcomes. You have to see, whether the expected situation is entirely different compared to the actual situations. You have to talk about the differences between the two, followed by what are the causes and what are the solutions for it. Then we come on to identifying of the alternative solutions to a problem. Now, finding out the alternatives is a very difficult task because one may be better than the other. So what you have to do is you have to be realistic in your approach. You have to be very, meticulous in making a choice. After you have developed the alternatives, now is the time to evaluate the alternatives, that which is the best alternative out of that. So you must develop a confidence score in this regard, that this is alternative is better than that. Now is the time to take decision making. Now decision making is a very, very difficult task because you have to take everything in one frame. You have to synthesize a complete information which is available in the organization. After evaluating the alternatives, you have to see that the feasibility aspect is there, and you must incorporate the experience, the research and development, the experimentation, and perhaps if you compare the three, the research and the analysis will give you the best results about selecting the alternatives, because it is more authentic and not at all subjective into consideration. Now is the time to implement. Implementation is a very difficult task because it involves the whole organizational people into it, proper planning, proper implementation process is there in terms of changing of the existing structure, authority responsibility structures, etc. And you have to make certain budget and schedules which in this regard, so that you are able to have a committed workforce which is promoted, and finally you are able to take the best decision making process.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for explaining us in detail ethical decision making process, the topic which we are discussing today. Friends, there is a lot more for you. You are requested to be with us as we are back after a short break. Thank you. Hello friends, welcome back to this session. Friends, today we are talking on ethical decision making process. In the previous session we discussed in detail on decision making process. Now we are going to continue further and we are going to specifically talk on ethical decision making process. And for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Namita Rajput. Dr. Namita Rajput is an eminent professor, and through her we always get in-depth knowledge on various topics. We believe that from today's session also you are going to grab maximum. So let's welcome our guest, Dr. Namita Rajput, once again. Hello ma'am, welcome to the lecture.
So let me give you a backdrop of what we did in the last session so that we are able to have a right connect between what we are going to do now. We started with the concept of the decision making process. Basically, decision making process is selecting a course of action from the multiple alternatives, and with this we started with the process like we have to define a problem, taking into consideration many aspects, your desired outcome, your actual situation, your expected situation. Then you have to identify the alternative solutions which are available in front of you. You have to evaluate each one of them, develop a confidence score relating to each alternative which is there in front of you. You have to then take a decision. So evaluating the alternatives and expecting a criteria, the managers must screen a non-feasible alternatives and select the most appropriate alternative that is going to help in achieving the desired objective. The alternatives can be selected through the following approaches. The first is your experience, because the past experience is a master of what you do in the future, followed by experimentation, because experimentation of the various alternatives will give you the real insight of which method is the best method. But when you see the flip side of it, the experimentation process involves a huge capital expenditure, so we would not like to take it forward and saying a stop to it. The third is the research and analysis. Perhaps this is the best method as far as the selection of the future variables is concerned, because this is the most suitable alternatives which gives you and given by the research and the analysis. This is the most suitable method in conserving the time and energy also. And finally, you implement the solution and implement the alternatives. Now, as far as the implementation of the alternative is concerned, it should be communicated to the complete departments, all the people who are associated and affected by the decision making, followed by it must be properly and meticulously planned. And in the process, whosoever is affected must be allowed to participate in the decision making process, and it must be communicated to each one of them. And if there is a changes in the existing structure, it must be endorsed and communicated. Any changes in the authority and responsibility also must be specifically assigned. And the resources allocated to each department must be diligently allocated in carrying out such decision making process. Not only this, you must make certain budgets, certain schedules, procedures and controls to ensure the effective implementation of the decision making process. A committed workforce must be promoted, and unless and everyone is committed to the decision making, and desired outcomes will not and never be achieved. Then the step 6 was evaluated decision making, that once you have taken the decision maker, it must be evaluated, monitored on a continuous basis. The alternatives should be regularly monitored through the progress reports to see whether the objective from which it was selected has been achieved or not. So the matter does not end there. The matter starts from it, that you have to start evaluating of what you did, that is, you have to do a post-mortem and the aftermath of the decisions which you have already taken, the alternatives which have already been selected. So you must evaluate your decision making, and that gives you a real insight of whether the progress is in process or not, or do any changes are required. And the monitoring process will give you a real insight of yes, what is right and what is wrong. And if not, the managers should make corrections whenever necessary or make changes in the implementation process. The implementation part must be taken into consideration very, very diligently. Now coming on to the ethical decision making. What is this and how it is different from the decision making process? Ethical decision making involves the following steps. 1. You have to define the problem, that is plus, identify the alternatives, evaluate the alternatives, make a decision, implement the decision, and evaluate the decisions. So these are the 6 steps which are involved in the ethical decision making process. Until now, we have been discussing a generic decision-making model that is followed in the management training programs. But our concern is not just decision-making, it is the ethical decision-making which makes a lot of difference. Ethical component of the decision-making process takes the form of a set of filters. That is, you have to see with a different lens altogether, because your perspective has one aspect, that is the ethical, which makes the difference, which makes a lot of difference as far as the decision making is concerned. Whatever you do, whatever steps are involved, you have to take into consideration the filters, that is the ethical aspects and the ethical lens connected with any kind of a decision making process. The purpose is to separate the sought after elements from their environment. At key steps in the process, the decision maker can stop and run his considerations through these filters, separate the ethical aspects from the remainder of the decisions. This ensures that the ethical issues involved in the decision can be given consideration. In their academic form, the language for these filters is too complex and academic for most employees. So we are now taking into consideration the ethical decision making process. So what is the key step in the process? The key step in the process is that the decision maker can stop and run his consideration through these filters and separate the ethical aspects from the remainder of the decision. That is, you have to evaluate every kind of a decision making and separate and identify what is the ethical content, what is the ethical part of this decision making process. If you are able to identify that, the things will be easier to take. You have to see what is the ethical aspect, content, lens, filter connected to a decision making process. This will not only ensure that the decision making which is done is ethical, but also ensure that you are able to take into consideration the things which are most important as far as the ethical lenses are concerned. In their academic form, the language for these filters is too complex and academic for most employees. What is the ethical decision making? To make it easy to understand and apply, the ethic filters word plus has been adapted. Now what is this plus? The P stands for the policies. It is convenient with the organizational policies, procedures and the guidelines. That is, what are the connected policies which are there as far as the ethical decision making is concerned? What are the procedures and what are the guidelines behind it? L is a legal. It is acceptable under the applicable laws and regulations. That is, you have to first see the policies of the organization followed by the legal aspect, that is, it is accepted under the applicable laws and regulations or not. U stands for universal. Does it conform to the universal principles, values the organization has adapted? And S stands for the self. Does it satisfy the manager's personal definition of right, good and fair? Plus presumes effective communication with all the employees so that there is a common understanding of organizational policies and procedures as they apply to the situation, the applicable laws and regulations, the agreed to a set of universal values, in this case empathy, patience, integrity and courage, the individual sense of right, fair and good arising from their personal value sets. So here you have to see what are the organizational policies and the procedures which are applying to a situation, what are the applicable laws and the regulations and the regulatory aspect to it, and you have to see the set of the universal values, in this case like empathy, patience, integrity and courage. Empathy is, that is, you see your problem from the other's point of view. The patience is a lot of deep concern and taking everything very, very diligently, at a calm level. You're not carried away by anything. The integrity and the courage. So these are the four value systems which are universal. The individual sense of right, good, arising from their personal value sets. The plus assumes a formal mechanism provided by the organization to allow the employees access to a definite interpretation of the policies, laws, and the universal values when their own knowledge of their plus factors is insufficient for them to make the decision with a high level of confidence. The plus filters work as an integral part of the steps 1, 3, and 6 of the decision-making process. Decision maker applies the 4 plus filters to determine if the ethical components of the decision making are being satisfied or not. This step 1, you have to define a problem, plus surface the ethical issues. Does the existing situation violate any of the plus considerations, that is the policies, the legal aspect, the universal aspect, and the self? So once you are able to analyze the plus filters, that is, you have, whenever any kind of a decision making takes place, you have to see in the light of plus, that is the policies, the legal aspects, the universality, and yourself. So what is the step 1? Define a problem plus surface the ethical issues. Does the existing situation violate any of the plus considerations or not? Is the first question. Step 2 is to identify the available alternative solutions to the problems. Now, coming on to step 3, you have to evaluate the identified alternatives, that is the plus assess their ethical impact. Will be alternative 1, I am considering resolve the plus violations. Will the alternatives being considered create any new plus considerations? Are the ethical trade-offs acceptable? Step 4 is to make a decision. Step 5 is to implement a decision. And step 6 is to evaluate a decision, that is the plus sorts out new ethical issues. Now coming on to ethical decision making. Does the resultant situation resolve the earlier plus considerations is the first thing. Are there any new plus considerations to be addressed? Because when you try and do the ethical filters applying the plus, there are so many situations and things which will spring up. So the first thing which you have to analyze is that, is there any, the resultant situation, does the resultant situation resolve the earlier plus considerations if there are any violations? If not, continue with that. Second, if taking into consideration the ethical decision making, any additional plus considerations are to be addressed or not is a big question. Third, the user should realize that the plus filters do not guarantee ethical decisions. Because it is your own self, it is your own, collating of the information in one frame that you will be able to take a right decisions yourself. They merely ensure that ethical component of the situation will be sorted out so that they might be considered. The plus suggests a process for assessing the ethical impact of a decision. Ultimately, whether or not the decision meets the ethical consideration of the organization or the ethical decision maker is a matter of personal responsibility. After all, ethics is about the choices. Ethics and values in business. The values represent what is right or wrong, and the whole body of the values is represented by ethics. What is ethical is value-based. Similar to ethics, values may have different meanings for different people. Increasing profits at a cost of the social benefits may be the economic values of one enterprise, and sacrificing a part of the profits for benefits of the society may be the social values of another business enterprises. The personal values thus influence the individual's action and whether together forms the basis of ethics. So, till now we have discussed so many aspects relating to plus, its consideration, its additional, its implementation, its overall connection and implementation as per as the ethical lenses and the filters is concerned. Now coming on to ethics and values in business. What is a business value? It's a very interesting topic. Business values are the beliefs that develop a system. Based on the sound business principles, which provides the management and the workers a drive to work for the successful accomplishment of its mission. These values become guides for the employee's action, and they will be able to take a good decision making, because the value system builds you. The value system gives you a rationale. The value system gives you the filters. And of course, the business unit deserves and derives the values from the nation where it is established, the industry to which it belongs, the people who constitute its workforce. So the value system is not a standalone process. It is a byproduct and is derived from so many things which you are already associated with, like the nation to which you belong, the industry to which you belong, and of course, you are a part and the parcel of the organizational and the economy workforce. So all these things matter a lot. A business enterprise that regards the business values as a part of its system shall use its resources to make itself a viable institution in the society. It must also subject itself to public visibility. That is, its activities should be open for public examination, discussion and judgment. A company which makes itself publicly visible will refrain from activities like hoarding, price fixing, black marketing, etc. The business values are the soul of the company. Just as we can reach out our deepest parts and discover our soul and true self within, enabling us to discover our own purpose in the life, a company can discover its soul center and purpose where its business values lie. We talk about an individual. An individual, will peep into himself, his heart, and you are able to discover the true self of your soul, and you will never do anything wrong. Similarly, if the business works with this kind of conviction that yes, the soul center is the business values and you should never violate them, of course the business will always be on a right track. Goethe Tagore asserts that the managers are guided by their value judgments. We have economic values, like the managers always search for the problems in the areas where the benefits of profit maximization can be achieved. Theoretical values. More than profits, the managers are guided by the force that will lead to the attainment of overall long-term goals of the organization, its maximization of the owners with the framework of the environmental forces. We have political values. Achievement of personal goals, more than anything else, is the aim of decision making who are backed by the political values. Now, why the business values are important is a very important thing to be considered. Business is a social organ that must accomplish the social goals. It is not running in isolation. It is a part and parcel of the society. So it must give back to society. So values make business conform to the social interest along with the economic interest. They make business a viable institution which has a social acceptance and recognition. They help in creating a corporate culture that is conducive to the business growth in the long run. They must provide the norms and the standards for measuring the business efficiency. They provide scope for improvement in business performance. They direct the business activities in the right direction by clearly differentiating between what is right and what is wrong. Now, coming on to the ethics and the values in the business, taking it forward as far as the importance of the value system in the business is concerned, it realizes a direct energy, motivate people, generate profits, and promote expansion. The values are the key for energizing the 5 growth engines of a company: the market, the product, the services, the organization, the people, and finance. The value raises the quality of the corporate engines and you elevate the work to a next level, that is the highest levels. The values are like never-ending goals. The higher the values, the more the energy, the effort required to achieve and sustain them. Similarly, the companies which rate their key corporate values the highest also report the highest levels of revenue, the growth and profitability in their respective industries. The values are the most powerful way to realize and harness the company's latest unutilized energies for the growth. So overall, we can say in today's lecture, we have talked about an entire process of the decision making. So let me give you a recap of entire 2 sessions which we did in the present context. We started with the concept of what is a decision making process. Decision making process is taking a decision in the light of so many factors. And what is the process involved? The first is that you have to define a problem, and defining a problem, you have to first think about the desired outcomes. After deciding what the desired outcomes are, you have to see the expected situation, the actual situations, have to compare the two, and finally, you have to search for the causes and the solutions for each problems. The second is you have to identify the alternatives to a problem. That is, you have to be very realistic in your approach. You cannot have opposing choices, and you must have the ample choices, is the concept. After you have done, you have to now evaluate the identified alternatives. How you have to identify the alternative is that evaluating the alternative decision making should look at the likely positive and the negative side of each alternative. It is very unusual. You must develop the confidence scores of each alternative which you have taken into considerations. Then of course you need to determine what results each alternative could yield, how profitable and probable is that those results will be realized. If evaluation is based on the facts, what is the expected outcome will occur. Then you have to take finally a decision. After evaluating the alternative against the accepted criteria, the managers screen the non-feasible alternatives and select the most appropriate alternatives which will help in achieving the desired objectives. And of course, when you talk about this, you must see the past experience, you must go for experimentation, and finally, the research and the analysis. If you compare the three, the research and the analysis perhaps is the most important objective way of selecting the alternatives, because it gives you the unbiased results, it gives you the most objective results, wherein you are able to harness your decision making to the best possible extent. Then is the time to implement the alternatives. How to implement the alternatives is a big task, because so many people are associated and linked and affected by the decision making, so you must involve them, you must have a proper plan for it. Then of course you have to be very effective and fruitful, the implementation. So better is to involve each one of them who is affected by it. And of course when you have to implement this, probably you have to change the structure of authority responsibility. It must be communicated to everyone, and in fact authority and responsibility structure must be very diligently defined. Resources should be allocated and to the respective departments to carrying out the decision making process. The budget schedules and any controls, if they have to be made, it has to be very, very effectively implemented. A committed workforce should be promoted. Unless everyone is committed to a decision making process, the desired outcomes will not be achieved. Finally, you have to evaluate the decision making. The implementation should be regularly monitored to know if its acceptance by the organizational members. The alternatives should be regularly monitored through progress reports, because once the decision making has already been done, now is the time to see that whether the decision making which has been done is in right light and perspective or not. So if the managers have to make corrections, it has to be done in a very diligent way. Now coming on to the ethical decision making. The ethical decision making is also composed of the 6 steps. That is, you have to define a problem, you have to identify the alternatives, you have to evaluate the alternative plus, you have to make a decision, you have to implement the decisions, and you have to implement the decision plus. So unless now we have a discussion of a generic decision making process, it is followed by the management training programs. But our concern is not just decision making, it is the ethical decision making process. The ethical component of the decision making process takes a certain forms of filters into it. Their purpose is to separate the sought after the environment is concerned. Now coming on to the key steps which are involved in the process is about the considerations which are there to ensure the ethical aspects and the issues are completely covered, The academic language for these filters is too complex and academic for most of the employees. But when you talk about the policies and the plus aspect of it, these are the filters from the ethical lens. That is, you have to see the policies, the legal aspect, universality, and the self. Does it satisfy the manager's personal definition of right and good or bad? So plus presumes the effective communication with all employees so that there is a common understanding that the organizational policies and the procedures as they apply to the situation, the applicable laws and the regulations, you have to see the empathy, patience, integrity and course. So plus filters plays a pivotal role as far as the ethical decision making is concerned. So I hope with this you are able to understand how the decision making is done, how the ethical decision making is concerned, what were the parameters which are discussed, because these are the things which are primarily required from the ethical point of view. Thank you so much.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving us this productive session. Friends, you are requested to write to us at info.cec@nic.in. Here you can write your questions as well as you can post your feedbacks also. We are going to meet very soon tomorrow. So keep watching us, keep writing us. Thank you for watching us. Thank you, ma'am.